Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping people take their leadership to the next level. Brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International.
Well, Richard, it's good to see you again.
Well, thanks, Sam. Hope you're having a good year.
So far, so good. Well, welcome to the podcast, everyone. We're so glad to have you with us. If it's your first time listening, a special welcome to you. And if this is if you've been with us from the beginning, then you're always welcome.
We're glad to have you back.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us again. Mm-hmm. So it's that riveting time again that we look at
What, talking with me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say.
Good for you, Sam.
But also, another riveting thing is our leadership profiles, our leader profiles that we've been doing here.
Pulling off the shelves from my biography section.
Yes, which is extensive, I must say.
Yes.
So today, this is someone who probably
needs no introduction.
Yeah, and it's also not surprising that we're going to do a podcast on this president.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us about him?
Well, I think it's probably time that we address George Washington.
Ah, yes.
One of the mythical heroes of American history.
Mm-hmm.
And there are, of course, many, many books written on him. I've not, sadly, read nearly as many as I ought to have. The primary biography, and of course, I kind of tend to think that if a biography isn't at least about 800 pages, it's
not worth.
It's barely worth getting into. And this biography, sadly, is just looking here right through to the index, is only 548 pages. So it's a lightweight biography, but
it just barely made it onto your shelf.
I guess. So it would require supplemental reading, but it's by Willard, Sterne, Randall, called George Washington: A Life, and that's the primary book that I pulled this out of. I've got a couple others. There's one by Joseph Ellis called His Excellency George Washington, which also was a national bestseller. And Ellis wrote an earlier book that I kind of enjoyed called Founding Brothers: The Revolutionary Generation, and he looks at several people like Hamilton and Franklin and so on, but has a really good section on George Washington that is very quotable. I've actually used that chapter in a class before, just to look at Washington's life kind of in summary. But Washington's one of those guys that even over 200 years later still exerts an influence. When a model that you set, by the way you led, becomes something that everyone follows afterward, then you say, well, there's influence there. Like, for instance, he served 2 terms as president and certainly could have been reelected pretty well till he died, but he walked away. He didn't have to. He could have been elected a 3rd term. But he voluntarily said two terms is enough. Yeah. And, of course, in his day, people were quite scared of a monarchy.
Right.
And probably the single greatest critique his enemies wanted to attack him was he saw himself as an American king. And that, for his generation, was a terrible insult. And so the great fear was you just become so popular, kind of like a Napoleon, that you just take over and become a king.
Yeah.
And so he walked away after 2 terms, and that became the unofficial rule for a long time.
Right.
And nobody until Franklin Roosevelt was ever able to be elected a 3rd term. Some tried it. People like Theodore Roosevelt and Ulysses Grant tried to run for a 3rd term. Both of them very popular presidents, especially Roosevelt. But they were unsuccessful, and it just seemed as if in the psyche, Washington's example, everybody just understood 2 terms is enough, and eventually the Congress just went ahead and voted that in to say that's enough for a president. So
and we did a whole podcast a few episodes back. I think it's episode 28 on leaving well.
Yeah, in fact, I think Ellis at one point in his book says Washington was the virtuoso of exits. He just had a way of leaving at just the right time, whether it was as a general or as the president. He always seemed to know when it was time to leave, and that was part of what made him so great.
So Washington, he has reached mythical proportions in the United States today, but all was not rosy for him.
No.
Was it?
No, there's some things about Washington that you look at and you say, well, of course that helped him. For instance, he was a giant of a man, especially in his day. He was about 6'4.5" tall, which clearly made him the tallest man pretty well any room he was in.
Sure.
You physically looked up to him before you might look up to him just out of his reputation. But and he had enormous courage, which I think certainly helped him win admirers. But at the same time, he also had a lot of shortcomings. He grew up in a relatively impoverished home. He never got to go to college, to university, which is unusual because among those founding fathers, whether it was Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, most of those founding fathers were extremely educated. The people who founded America, for the most part, were some of the smartest, most educated, well-read people in the entire country. And so, and yet Washington is the one exception. He's the military hero that a lot of the other guys aren't. But he was not well-read, and in fact, he spent most of his time reading newspapers, whereas Jefferson was constantly reading the latest books from Europe and so on. And Washington was always kind of insecure about that. You think George Washington insecure about anything?
Yeah.
But he was, and he often, when he was in a room with Jefferson and Madison and some of those other guys, he often deferred to their opinion and recognized them to be geniuses and much better educated than he was. Interestingly, Washington also had a very difficult relationship with his mother. You sort of think, here's a guy who charges into battle on a horse and fearlessly faces British bullets and musket fire and so on, but yet he had a very difficult relationship with his mother. His father died when he was fairly young, and Washington just wanted to escape his mother's clutches. At one point, he actually ran away from home as a young man to try to join the British Navy, of all things. Huh. And his mother sent people to apprehend him and bring him home. At one point, she was a widow living on his property and refused to leave. His author says, his biographer says, it took him 29 years to finally get his mother off his property. After he married, Washington kept his mother in a separate house than the one he lived in, and he never made his wife go over to see his mother, or her mother-in-law, but he would go over now and then, just sort of bravely face the enemy fire. His mother was constantly asking for money and constantly criticizing him. And so, just on a personal level, our heroes have feet of clay. They're people. They overcome issues.
And I think from, when you give a long span of time, when you're looking back, a lot of these leaders of, founding fathers and so forth, they do sort of rise to a sort of mythical persona that they're just sort of these gods of old that just did everything right and had no flaws, but that's not the case.
No, it's and in fact, for me, it always makes me appreciate them more that they had to overcome all kinds of things, just like everybody else, if they're going to rise to greatness. And I guess the other thing with Washington that would be similar to so many leaders like Abraham Lincoln is that he experienced a lot of failure in his life. The first election he ever ran for, he lost. Most of the early battles that he fought in, he lost. In fact, many people accused him of launching a 7 years war between Britain and France because of basically an impetuous mistake that he made in the frontier of America. He had to surrender forts. At one point, he was an advisor to General Braddock, the top British general, and it was his advice that led to one of the worst defeats in British history, where the British Army was just cut down and destroyed, one of the worst defeats ever, 2/3 of all the soldiers were casualties, the worst disaster in British history. And at one point in his early career, where he's trying to make a name for himself, he said, "I have been upon the losing order ever since I entered the service." I mean, ever since he's been in the army, he's just continually lost. And so, at that point, you would think, is this guy, well, he needs to find another line of work. He's obviously not working in his area of strength here. If every time he tries to lead a military unit, they get mauled by the enemy. And even when he leads the Revolutionary Army, most of his early battles he loses. In fact, many people would say, well, the greatest success he had is that despite continually getting pummeled by the British, he kept his ragtag army together. But he had all kinds of casualties. In 1 year, between 1777 and 1778, about half of Washington's troops were either killed, captured, or wounded. And so, you look back over that. In fact, when he first battle that he fought in the Revolutionary War, he lost 1,000 men, and was quoted as saying, "Good God, are these the men in which I am to defend America?" Of course, he didn't have a lot to work with, but I mean, they were beaten so badly by the disciplined British Army that it just looked like an impossible situation. So if you look at Washington's early stages, examples, and by the way, ironically, Washington's goal as a young man was to become an officer in the British Army. But
a little awkward.
Yeah, but the British, of course, were such snobs in that day that if you were an American, you were considered riffraff, uncivilized, uncouth frontiers person that could never give orders to proper British soldiers. And so some people, I think it's maybe psychologizing a bit much, but basically he wasn't good enough for the British Army. He would never even be an officer for the British. He was rejected and never allowed to do that. And so eventually he leads the army against the British, becomes the top officer for the Americans, and ironically defeats them. The guy that couldn't be an officer for the British ultimately beats the Brits and all their officers. And so he had to overcome a lot of early failure, rejection, stress in his personal life, lack of education. And so this is not a person you look at and just say, wow, this guy's destined for greatness.
Yeah, certainly not at the time. None of his contemporaries probably would say that, based on his track record, he had any hope of success.
He needs to go into business or something else. But military success was not his forte.
Yeah. So based on your reading, what reasons would you give then for his success and, these early days of his and certainly military career was not necessarily spotless by any stretch of the imagination. So, what was it about Washington that led to his ultimate success, and what can we take away from that?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One I've touched on already, and that's his courage. He had incredible courage. And oftentimes when people come out of a military background, someone like Napoleon or someone else, what makes them stand out is they are brave. And I mean, when there are musket balls flying through the air, cannon being fired, and you're on a horse where you stand out, you're 6'4", on a horse, like
don't want to be that guy.
It is hard to miss you. And yet, one of his famous quotes after a battle, one of the early battles he fought in, there were 4 bullet holes in his jacket and in his hat. I mean, the bullets were literally just passing through his clothing, but not striking him. And of course, if you get hit by a musket in that day, the surgeons there were basically butchers. They just cut off whatever limb was hit by a musket. And you hope that you didn't bleed to death on the field. But after one of those battles where he had bullet holes all through his clothing, he famously said, "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound." Now, not many are going to think bullets being fired, whistling by you,
poking holes in your jacket.
That there's anything charming about that sound. Mm-hmm. But he apparently there was something that just the adrenaline that got him when he would do that. And he had some things that he said that were interesting. He was a great encourager. He, on the battlefield, he could see, at one point he saw a bunch of soldiers that were fleeing in fear, and he rode up to them and turned them around and said, at one point he came across a bunch of soldiers running in fear from the British. He rides up and says, "Parade with us, my brave fellows. There is but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." Well, several things were interesting. He didn't say charge into this fiery onslaught. He said, "Parade with me," which almost sounds like a walk in the park. He calls them brave fellows, even as they're running in retreat and fleeing from the battlefield. He says there's only a handful of them. He minimizes. He says don't, he cuts the enemy down to size. And he says we'll have them shortly, meaning we will be victorious if you'll just, and of course they did turn around and follow him. They did win the day. And yet he could have cursed out. Other generals would have been cursing out the cowards, the people fleeing the field. He says, "Parade with me, brave fellows."
Yeah.
That's a, and when the whole battle is on the line, and he's not just cursing out these deserters, but urging them forward. Won him the undying loyalty of his troops, and so he just did a number of things. Even later, when it looked like the soldiers might have a rebellion because they'd not been paid properly, not provisioned well, and at one point it looked like the soldiers were going to just rebel and demand all kinds of things from the government. He went to try to calm them down, and near the end, in a famous speech he gives at the end, he's going to read a letter to the soldiers, and he has to stop in a dramatic fashion and put on his spectacles so that he can read his notes. And he says, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I've grown gray in your service, and now find myself growing blind." And of course, his soldiers that were ready to rebel are in tears, watching their brave general, who's aged, who's lost a lot of his eyesight. And he says, "In your service." You see the humility of the top person saying, I've tried to serve you. And all of a sudden it just put to shame these soldiers who were demanding their rights and demanding this and that. And so Washington had a way around men. He was a very strong just person. He's one of the best horsemen of his day, physically very strong, very sturdy, never really got sick, even if he was facing all kinds of harsh winter weather and cold and wet. He had a way of just connecting with his men where he would not live in a style that was way above his soldiers. If they were hungry, if they were camping out, he'd be in a tent camping with them, kind of thing. And so he endeared the soldiers to him. And even though they might be losing, he didn't always give them success early on. They knew that he cared about them, and he was with them. And I think maybe one other thing just to say is that he knew it was about something bigger than himself.
Yeah.
He knew it was for his country, not his own reputation. There are some leaders that it's all about them and their glory, especially in the military field. Sometimes it's all about winning the awards and the recognition. But Washington was keenly aware it was about something much greater than him, the founding of an entire nation, that he knew that he would not always be around, but it was about the country and what was best for the country. And when you lead that way, where you lead because of what's best for the organization, that is a recipe for greatness and influence. And certainly Washington was a master at that.
Great. Well, let's take a quick break, and then we'll carry on with Mr. Washington.
Twice a year, Blackaby Ministries hosts a spiritual leadership coaching workshop in the Atlanta area. The focus of this workshop is learning how to ask the right questions to help move people onto God's agenda. The next workshop is May 6th through 8th, and registration is now open. The early bird rate is available until April 1st, and space is limited. To find out more and to register, visit blackabycoaching.org. Links will be in the show notes.
Before the break, Richard, you mentioned how George Washington sort of addressed some fleeing people, some fleeing soldiers from the battle, and sort of shaped the reality. And that reminded me of an episode we've done in the past. And I believe it was episode 23 about leaders getting results. And one of the things that you'd mentioned there was leaders shape the reality that of the people that they lead. And so that made me think of that. And so if you want to hear more of that, you can go back and listen to episode I think it was episode 23 where we talked about leaders getting results.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
Oh, yeah. But I just think it's interesting, how they can, just with their words,
right,
change the situation. I mean, they don't change the situation. They just change the perspective
and so
of those that they led.
When those soldiers were fleeing in fear from those British soldiers, they see Washington riding toward the soldiers, boldly saying, they're not so tough. We can take them. The battle's not over yet. And I think sometimes as leaders, how we position, if we're worried and fretting and anxious, that sends a message.
Yeah, I think there's just so much power in shaping the perception of what it is you're facing.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, so as we wrap this up, what were some of the challenges that Washington had to overcome as he led?
Well, there were many. Even, we've talked about early on setbacks, losing elections, losing battles. During the Revolutionary War, it's estimated he lost about half his net worth. There was a financial toll. He paid a significant price. He didn't get rich by leading during the Revolutionary War. He actually lost a lot, which again gives you credibility because you realize this guy's not in it for the money. He's serving a higher cause than that. Later, he was always, as tough as he was, and even though he said it, something charming in the sound of musket balls flying by your head, but he tried to not let criticism get to him, but at times it would, and he'd read all the newspapers and be deeply hurt at times by people he considered his friends that were undermining him, criticizing him. And I've shared earlier, the biggest critique for him typically was he treated himself like a king, that he just wanted to be a monarch, a European monarch in an American form. And, when you've lost half your worth, sacrificing it for your country, you faced all kinds of enemy fire that you should have been killed from. And then people say, oh, you're just being selfish. That hurts, And so I think he always battled with that to try to keep doing the right thing. And he was quite good, really, at rising above that. He rarely ever do you find him sniping back.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most difficult times was that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison began to form a kind of a rival party. And you could never just take Washington on head on because he was just too well loved and respected. But Jefferson and Madison, both great leaders in their own right, but they undercut Washington. They helped promote division, even though they both served under Washington. And that hurt Washington when some of your key people are fighting among themselves. Jefferson was very much opposed to Hamilton. And so both of them are in Washington's cabinet, but his own cabinet is fighting among themselves, and that wore Washington down. I mean, there were so many huge issues for the country, and yet he had to endure a bunch of sniping among his own lieutenants, and at times, especially with Jefferson and his party would be promoting criticisms of Washington, but Washington wouldn't just come right out and join the fray. But he had a way of kind of letting people like Jefferson know that he was fully aware of the betrayal, the lack of loyalty. But he never let himself just be dragged down into the muck and mire. And I think that's probably one of the reasons for his enduring greatness, is that he always took the high road. He refused just to sort of snipe back and start slinging mud back at his opponents. But when he finally did finish his second term and John Adams was taking over as the next president, he said to Adams, I am fairly out, you are fairly in. See which of us will be happiest. I think by the time he left being president and facing all the undercutting and criticism, he was happy to do that and return to Mount Vernon. And of course, famously, on his deathbed, when Washington realizes he's going to die. Of course, back then they had bloodletting. That was the number one cure. I'm so grateful now it's extra strength Tylenol. But back then, if you had pain or discomfort, they thought, well, you've got unhealthy fluids in you, and the way to get rid of them was to cut you and bleed you and get all those bad fluids out of your body.
Yeah, seems legit.
And so when he's struggling with the bad cold or something, they're cutting him and bleeding him, and of course he's losing his strength. And when he knew he was dying, he said to his doctor, "Doctor, I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." And right to the end, he faced with courage the ultimate challenge that we all face in death. And he said, "'Tis well." And the last thing that he did, apparently, was take his own pulse to see how he was doing, and then died. That self-sufficiency to the very end, self-control, saying, my pulse seems to be declining. And then the last thing he does before he dies. And yet things like that were the stuff of legend for Washington. He's the one who chose Washington, D.C. as the capital. And as Ellis says very eloquently, Washington was accustomed to history proving him right. And he made a number of decisions that, looking back, you realize, such as only running for 2 terms and so on, that later people look back on and said he had an uncanny sense of what needed to be done, what was the right thing to do. And, of course, it had never been done before in America. He was charting new ground. And so when you don't have your bearings, you don't know really, should it be this way or that way. He perhaps more than any other American president set the standard and the direction for a country that even 200 plus years later, we still follow his example. And so certainly a great leader when your influence outlasts you by centuries. You realize he's not perfect. He had his shortcomings, but certainly was the man for his time, and continues to exert a positive influence to this very day.
Sure. Well, tell us again the 2 books, the 2 biographies that you recommend, and we'll be sure to leave links to these in the show notes.
All right. The author that I read was Willard, Sterne, Randall, George Washington, A Life, and then Joseph J. Ellis, His Excellency George Washington. And Ellis has written an earlier book called Founding Brothers, The Revolutionary Generation, which I also think is a very interesting take on some key moments in American history.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, review us on Apple Podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. If you have questions or comments, please email us at podcast@blackaby.org.